folks, so the weather this last week has really warmed up. I think we've got highs in the 70s even. I'm sure the cold weather is not over. We're just having a little warm spell right now. But I decided to get out in the garden and do a massive garden harvest of things that I have been needing to get out of here for a while. With the nights this last month getting into the teens and 20s, I've had a lot of frost damage on my plants. Not so much that they're completely ruined, but they needed to come out of the ground or cut off the plant in the case of broccoli and Brussels sprouts before I lost any more of my harvest. Now, most of the time over winter, I can slowly grow my winter vegetables, but there is some point where it's just too cold for them, and once the food itself, like the heads of broccoli or heads of cauliflower, start getting damaged, you just want to get those things out of there because it's not going to be worth it trying to make them grow bigger versus the amount of damage they'll sustain on really cold nights. So I got out here earlier in the week and just did a massive sweeping harvest of most of the things that really needed to come out immediately in the garden, and I did record some footage which I will show for you guys right now. These daikon radishes never cease to amaze me. This is so big, and it has like some purpling right here on the top, which is interesting. Like I said, these came from goingtoseed.org. So they're a mixed bag of radishes. You never know what you're gonna get. But this was a very, very neat outcome this year. What is happening? Oh my goodness. Where are you going? What is this? And we're back. Now that you guys have seen everything that came out of the garden, I wanted to go through the entire garden with you and let everyone know what is growing, what's surviving, thriving, or dying in my January garden. First and foremost, can we appreciate how much space I gave myself for more garden beds when I made this fence? And I did get 6 pieces of wood the other day to make 2 more 5x10 garden beds. That's all I'm gonna do right now at this moment in time. The wood itself was $100 for 2 beds, and the soil is gonna cost way more than that. So we're gonna take it slow, see what I can afford to build this year. As I've said before, I am not hurting for space. Last year I did well enough with the beds that I have to grow a ton of food that I am still using over this winter. So we're not in a race against time to try and get more beds. So starting at this corner, we have my ugliest and saddest looking bed in the entire garden. This is where most of the damage was sustained by the chickens. These are all broccoli with a couple cauliflower plants. And for the most part, they're just filling space at this point. I have already harvested most of the heads. So you can see I have some side shoots here. The chickens actually got into that. So the loss of foliage in this bed isn't really a disappointment because this was the first bed that I harvested, and therefore it didn't really have any food I was worried about. Broccoli will continue to produce side shoots like this if the plant stays in the ground. So if you are growing broccoli and you don't need the space immediately, I would recommend just leaving the whole plant in the ground, and then once in a while you'll get tiny little florets to harvest off, maybe for like one quick meal or a side or something. But it's not doing any harm staying in the ground, so that's where it's gonna stay and apparently feed the chickens. Directly north is where I have some Brussels sprouts. These were old cauliflower plants that I've already harvested, and they died off after I took the head. As you saw in the harvest, I did take one of these Brussels sprout plants and harvested, but I'm going to leave these in the ground. They're not getting too much frost damage, and I'm not quite sure. This guy looks close to being ready. I might harvest this guy pretty soon. I haven't really successfully grown Brussels sprouts in the past. I had a couple plants last year that didn't do really well. The timing, I think, this year when I planted these is better. But something is still not ideal because I'm not getting huge, tall plants. They should be like this tall. And I'm not getting a ton of Brussels sprouts. I'm still doing something wrong and I haven't figured it out yet. I also still have a few more rutabagas left to harvest. And they're just dispersed throughout several beds. I have one right there. I harvested 2 from this space earlier. But I didn't do a full rutabaga allotment this year. I didn't grow a lot like I did last year. Mostly because, I mean, I did eat them. I liked them. I continue to eat them, but no one else really did. So I don't need a ton to grow if I'm going to be the only one in this house eating the rutabagas. Starting back at the front, this is where most of my root vegetables are. I did harvest a daikon radish and a few either Easter egg radishes or French breakfast radishes. I don't remember which ones they were. And I've still got all of these beets here, which are still not heading to an appropriate size for me to pick them. This whole garden bed has just been completely devastated over and over again by my chickens before I had this fence up, when they were still getting in here all the time. And the carrots, I can't blame this on the chickens because the carrots really aren't growing that big anyways. Here's one little guy. I didn't thin them out very well when I planted them because frankly I wasn't expecting to get anything anyways. I'm terrible at growing carrots, or I just haven't found the right way to do it here in the desert. But these guys are cute. They're little, and they're not doing any harm staying in the ground, so I'm hoping as it warms up over the spring, I'll maybe throw some fertilizer down and see if we can get these guys to get a little bit bigger. Even though it took all winter to grow them, I'll be happy if I get some actual real-sized carrots I can use. This garden bed is mostly one that has been devastated by chickens, at least on one side of the bed as well. I don't know why they were very obsessed with where I kept my onions, but most of the leeks and onions I had planted on this side of the bed are gone just because of all the chicken scratching that was done here. I've got a few big ones that survived. I was just throwing in onions and leeks haphazardly wherever I had space, so I'm not really sure which one is which in these tiny little plants. We'll have to wait come spring to see what they turn into. But the rest of this bed is promise cabbage and anquesan cabbage, I believe. I know I'm pronouncing that wrong, and one of you guys told me, sent me a YouTube link how to pronounce it right, and I thank you. I don't think I can do that though, so I'm just gonna go with anquesan, something like that. But that's what this bed is full of, and they did not come to maturity before we got to our really cold nights. So I'm leaving these and those, which is basically the same thing, in the bed through the spring to see if I actually get a head of cabbage when the weather starts warming up. And here in the 4x4 and 2x4 beds on both sides of this trellis, I have garlic that is doing just fine. As usual, garlic is a great grower here over the winter. And as long as you keep it watered but not too moist and just regularly check the soil, they will just putter along happily for you until the spring when it's time to harvest. I do recommend fertilizing maybe once or twice, or if you don't want to fertilize over the winter, just fertilizing at the beginning of spring, because garlic is a heavy feeder, and they've been come spring and when they really start growing again with the warmth, they've been in the ground for a very long time, and that's been a very long time for them to deplete all the nutrients in the soil. So I will be fertilizing these guys probably within the next month, and then likely once more again before the harvest, which should be sometime in June. No, that's too late. May, maybe May or June, somewhere around there. And usually to fertilize, I'll just get like a good Fox Farm organic fertilizer or something, a dry powdered one, throw it over the top of the bed, and then that day I'll just hand water with a hose instead of using the drip system, just to make sure that fertilizer works into every aspect of the soil And alternatively, I've done this in the past, but it is very, very time consuming and annoying. You can do liquid fertilizer, like in a 5-gallon jug, mix it, pour it over each plant if you'd like to do that. It just takes too long. I don't feel like doing that. I've done it. But the lazy and super easy way is just getting a dry powdered fertilizer and then watering over it. In my 2x4 beds on both sides of the trellis, my peas are for the most part gone, but I do have some alive here at the base that I'm hoping comes back in the spring, and maybe I'll get a harvest of peas before it gets too hot. And having this green here in the base of the pea plant is the exact reason I didn't clean all this dead foliage out. Right now, it's acting as insulation and protecting the base of the plant from the coldest of the weather, so that hopefully it can just hang out in its warm little blanket until next month when it starts warming up, and it wouldn't be a complete waste of time that I planted these seeds in the fall and didn't get anything out of them, because I have the hopes of them coming back in the spring. I just want to have peas. Same story over here. My peas are gone. This is a calendula plant that is also gone. It's just too cold for these guys. But I did plant a couple extra cloves of garlic I had left inside this bed, as well as this other 4x4 bed that has garlic. It's all doing swimmingly. I'm very excited for this next harvest. This 10x5 bed here was filled with cauliflower and cabbage that have, for the most part, been completely harvested. There are a few things that remain in this bed, but they're mostly unusable. This is a cabbage that ended up getting some frost damage. I can still use this. I'll probably pick him here within the next week to make some coleslaw, but I'll just have to cut him off, like completely chop off half, which greatly reduces my harvest. I really just should have gotten out here long before I did and harvested what I needed to. And I have several cauliflower out here that have just been damaged by the frost and are, for the most part, unusable. It looks healthy over here on the sides, but it has a very odd texture when you try and eat frost damaged cauliflower. And that really stinks. I had a lot of cauliflower loss this year because I just didn't harvest them in time. The reason I didn't harvest them in time was I was hoping they would get bigger. Before our really cold nights started, they had not grown enough, and I was like crossing my fingers, hoping if I wrapped them enough that they would stay warm and not get damaged, but then just a ton of them got damaged. So another lesson learned this winter, I just have to do all of my cauliflower earlier. I'm probably gonna have to start them in July and hope they make it through the heat. Oh well. I did find out that the chickens absolutely love cauliflower, so I'm just feeding little cauliflower snacks to them now. My in-ground beds, for the most part, have been harvested, as you saw in the video. I had a very large harvest of all of these broccoli plants. I see that I missed some. There's a little floret I'll have to come back and get. And it's been cold enough that even some of the broccoli has been frost damaged. Good thing about these is I can just come along and break off the individual florets and leave the damaged one behind. But these should probably be gotten pretty soon before our weather gets cold again. But it's so tiny. It's because they're so tiny, I just tell myself like, oh, just leave them out. They'll grow a little bit more, you'll get a better harvest. And then all it takes is one night, and the whole head is just like, gross. This first row here was mostly cauliflower, which has been just disgustingly frost damaged. That's so nasty. So the cauliflower was a big loss, really the only big loss that I had this year, but I had planted a lot of it. That's why it was a large loss. At the beginning of the fall season, I had done an experiment last year where I wanted to see how my winter plants fared planting earlier in the more heat of the fall versus later in the cool of the fall. The goal of this experiment was to determine when the best planting time was to get a harvest of all of my crops before it got too cold at night for them to keep going. And the difficulty with the opposite end of that is that our summers are really hot and our falls are really hot, and that doesn't bode well for a lot of fall plants that like the cooler temperatures. Generally, I think what I learned from the experiment last year was that I need to just plant earlier. So I think that earlier is going to be better, especially in the case of cauliflower. No matter how hot it is, I need to try and get these plants in the ground because they just don't come to maturity before it freezes, and then I lose tons of cauliflower plants that I could have eaten and stored and saved for the rest of the winter. But now they're chicken food. But never fear, because I have tons of plants that never made it to maturity before the cold weather came. So I'm hoping that they take off in about a month and I get a harvest out of them. This is an encoison cabbage that I'm hoping did not try and form a head and then peter out of energy. I'm hoping that with all of these, because they've domed like they were starting to form a head, and I'm just not quite sure if when it starts to warm up they'll like pick up where they left off, or if that technically is their cabbage head and it's not going to get any bigger and they're just wasting my space. But we'll see how it goes come here in about a month. Maybe I will have a ton of food that I just had to wait all winter for. That would be super cool, because normally I can't grow spring crops. It gets too hot too quickly. But if they're already growing, then they're half a step ahead. And here in my onion bed, everything is going well. Although, as you can see, these guys are craving the sun a little bit. It'll come back sooner than you want it to, buddy. And now that these onions are getting to be a bigger size where you can actually see where they are, I'm starting to think I didn't grow enough. We go through a ton of onions. Pretty girls. Well, that is it. The entirety of what I'm growing in my winter garden. And for those of you wondering, the fence is working and there have been no more chickens in here since I figured out it was that space at the far north end of the gate that wasn't fenced off. That's where they were getting in. I've used one of the old green fencings to just cover that space up until we put a more permanent thing in place. And since I put it there, no chickens have messed up my garden. So I am very, very relieved that was the problem and they weren't actually just hopping over. Well, that is it, guys. Thank you for joining me on this January 2024 winter garden tour and harvest that I did a couple days ago. And I will catch you on the next one.